Thank you for joining me. I want today to offer some introductory reflections on Robert Nozick's defensive political libertarianism. And I want to start by saying that the political libertarians in the contemporary world have tended at every turn to lose. They continue to be a vocal minority, but the trend over the last 100 or 150 years or so in virtually all of the developed democracies has been towards greater governments, larger bureaucratic structures, and fewer personal freedoms. And the political libertarians are acutely aware of this, and in fact, much of their movement is an intentional reaction against these kinds of trends. Robert Nozick himself developed his own views on political libertarianism in response to John Rawls's articulation of progressive opinions about the purpose of government and the justification of governance in deeply divided pluralistic societies. Nozick developed his views in a variety of different venues, but the most famous of these venues, of course, is his great work, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Incidentally, Nozick and Rawls were colleagues at the time in the philosophy department at Harvard University when they wrote these famous dueling works, Theory of Justice and Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And Nozick wrote his intentionally with the aim of refuting a lot of Rawls's claims. Now, Nozick asks us in this famous work to start with an imagined construct, a state of nature. And he doesn't insert too many assumptions into the state of nature. He just tries to think about what it might be like in the absence of governance and why we human beings might want governance. And when he does that, he says, well, very quickly it's clear that there would arise a large number of problems, inconveniences at best, and deeply damaging problems at worst. And the state of nature that Nozick seems to have in mind here is something like John Locke's state of nature, neither thoroughly bad and horrific like Hobbes's, nor thoroughly good and morally innocent, amoral if you will, like Rousseau's state of nature. Nozick's state of nature is more a middle-of-the-road view of how humans are and what human beings' tendencies are like. Nozick, in his great text, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, talks extensively about why a state might arise and what it might look like, how it could naturally arise out of a state of nature. And he asks us to imagine ourselves accumulating property in the state of nature, and he asks us to imagine what we might do once we have accumulated property. And his own opinion is that one thing that we would do is we would seek to defend ourselves and our property against others. But there are certain costs, externalities, to defending ourselves against the machinations of others. One such example of a cost is the possibility of yourself getting injured when you try to defend yourself. It's time inefficient to try to defend your property. You could be doing other things during that time. It's expensive. You often have to expend abundant resources to defend yourself. For these reasons, Nozick thinks very quickly in the state of nature what would arise is a series of protective associations, mutual protective associations. These kinds of associations would be groups of people who band together and who seek to pay dues in return for protection against potential threats, be they natural threats or human threats. Obviously, natural threats would involve natural disasters, and human threats, more specifically, would involve other people maybe trying to steal our property. And Nozick thinks that these mutual protective associations would be purchased, that is, a place in them would be purchased by all of the property owners, and over time they would assume upon themselves a monopoly upon the protection of our property. Now, he asks us to imagine different protective associations dueling with each other, but eventually he thinks that what will end up happening is a particular protective association will gain a monopoly on the use of violence in a particular geographical territory. Now, he asks us also to recognize that this is not always quite a state yet. He emphasizes that a mutual protective association does not fulfill some of the responsibilities of a state, but it does form, he seems to think, the core of what the purpose of a state is. So in response to the question, why have governance at all? Why not just have anarchy, which Nozick thinks is the fundamental question of political philosophy? His answer is, well, it's not a question of why, it's a question of how. Because governance will naturally arise, whether we like it or not, in the context of the other kinds of aims that we are trying to achieve. Now, Nozick finishes his analysis of how this the proto-state or night watchman state will arise by asserting that this is basically an invisible hand explanation that he has offered for us for how such a state might come about. An invisible hand explanation is an explanation of a phenomenon which appears to be deeply coordinated and guided, but in fact actually is the product of a bunch of individual agents, each of whom chooses only his own welfare and does not necessarily take into mind the aims and considerations of the collective. An example of an invisible hand phenomenon is highway traffic. Your traffic may be good, your traffic may be bad on the highway, but it is an incredible coordination system that we human beings have developed, where we get in our cars and we go, all of us, on the same side of the road, driving in the same direction, and we exit at our destination. And everyone does this. We all do this simultaneously. It is as if an invisible hand is directing all of us in the ways that are most efficient. And yet no invisible hand, of course, is doing such a thing. It is a highway traffic system that is being brought about by virtue of our own individual choices, which we are seeking to execute in accordance with our own individual wills, not thinking about the good of the collective. And that's what Nozick thinks happens in the development and formation of the state. We each individually make choices to protect our own property, and in the context of those choices, what arises is a proto-state, a night watchman state, a mutual protection association, and ultimately a full-blown state with all of the citizenship requirements and all of the, in return, government benefits that are provided by such an arrangement. I'll talk more about such things in other videos, but Nozick does think that the state is a product of an invisible hand kind of a process.